Okay, well, thank you and thanks for the invitation, Pramod. Worst possible chair is the one who keeps blabbing on and on and on. So we'll just get to the first speaker, which is, and I'll take 5 minutes at the end, chair's prerogative. We'll go with Commodore Anil Singh of the National Maritime Foundation. And I think, as Pramod said, 10 to 12 minutes, right? Pramod?
Yes, sir.
Okay, 10 to 12 minutes. So, Commodore Singh, please, the floor is yours. Commodore Singh, you need to unmute your video.
No, yeah,
Yes,
Sorry,
I
am I clearly audible now?
absolutely, sir.
Okay, thank you. My apologies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it is a great privilege, to be here this morning amongst a galaxy of acknowledged experts on the Indo-Pacific, whose views, I think, over the years have shaped much of the discourse on this region. And I'd also like to extend my compliments to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and his team at NIICE for organizing such a thought-provoking conference, and also my sincere thanks for giving me this opportunity to be a part of it. So I would also seek your indulgence to make a small correction to my affiliation. I'm actually the Vice President of the Indian Maritime Foundation, which is different from the National Maritime Foundation, though I'm also associated with the National Maritime Foundation as a life member and an honorary adjunct fellow. Anyway, before I proceed with the subject of my presentation, I would also like to express my admiration for NIS, which has constantly focused its attention on the maritime dimension of the Indo-Pacific. In our globalized and interconnected world that we live in, trade dependencies are stretching across continents, with the oceans being the medium of connectivity. And with almost 90% of global trade which travels over the sea, no country, whether it has a coastline or not, can afford to ignore the maritime domain and its own economic interests. And this was very aptly highlighted by Dr. Jaiswal in his opening remarks yesterday, where he explained the significance of the theme of the conference, Sagar to Sagar. Coincidentally, this also resonates with India's policy of security and growth for all in the region, described by the same acronym, Sagar, which now underpins almost all of India's activities in the maritime domain. Therefore, in keeping with the theme of the conference and the topic for this panel, which is maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, I will just share a few thoughts, my thoughts on the subject of maritime domain awareness, which is referred to more commonly as MDA. And this term has almost become an integral part of the maritime security lexicon in the 21st century, after it came into prominence following the tragic events of 11 September 2011 in the United States. The brazenness of those attacks had also led to the realization that the vast and largely, unregulated ocean spaces surrounding the US make it very vulnerable to an attack from the sea, and underscored the importance of gaining adequate awareness about developments in the maritime domain. And in my opinion, in the future, MDA is not only going to be the single most significant factor determining maritime security, but perhaps all activity in the maritime domain. In fact, the International Maritime Organization describes maritime domain awareness, or MDA as I'll refer to it during the course of my talk, as an all-encompassing term, and it has defined it as, in quotes, effective understanding of any activity associated with the maritime environment that would impact upon the security, safety, economy, or environment, unquote. MDA is actually a multidimensional concept, and it relies upon multiple sources of information, including space, air, surface, underwater, cyber, electronic, human, and visual, amongst others. Therefore, for it to be effective, its collection, its fusion, analysis, display, and dissemination to all stakeholders is essential. But why is MDA important? With 70% of the earth covered by water, 80% of the global population living near the coast, and almost 90% of global trade and energy traveling over the sea, the importance of MDA is not restricted only to maritime security in the traditional sense of the term. But in this century of the seas, it is more about developing a better understanding of the entire maritime domain, be it the marine environment, the impact of climate change, the sustainable exploitation of the oceans, maritime transportation and connectivity, the blue economy, the livelihood and development of coastal communities, marine hydrology, or the mysteries of the deep. However, my focus today will be more on the security dimension of MDA. Almost every activity in the oceans now is underpinned by security. Besides the usual traditional and non-traditional security, this includes trade security, energy security, environmental security, the security of critical undersea installations like submarine cables and pipelines, amongst many others. As a result, MDA-2 has developed a very distinct maritime security connotation. From a military or constabulary perspective, there is a view that MDA is too vast a term in scope and substance, and therefore perhaps maritime situational awareness will be a more apt term. However, from a larger perspective, I think MDA is perhaps still the more widely accepted term. The maritime domain has been beset by security challenges ever since man first ventured into the sea. It has been responsible for the rise and fall of great powers. It has shaped global history, and it has been the medium for global connectivity for over 5,000 years. MDA-2 has been around since then, though perhaps in a different form. The knowledge of the oceans, a deep understanding of the winds and tides, and man's inherent desire to explore uncharted depths and unknown lands enabled intrepid voyagers to sail across the globe and create huge empires in distant lands. It also gave rise to pirates, buccaneers, and all manner of maritime crime, and also spawned contestation and conflict on the high seas. Of course, over the centuries, time and technology has led to a better understanding of the oceans and enabled a greater utilization of what it offers. This has also led to the emergence of an ever-widening spectrum of non-traditional and transnational security challenges, which are increasingly shaping the global and regional maritime discourse in the 21st century. The nature of the oceans as a unifying medium, providing global connectivity, makes it imperative that the seas remain safe, secure, and stable for the passage of trade and energy across geographies. Hence the importance of effective maritime domain awareness. A word about MDA and the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific region is becoming increasingly confrontational. There are trouble spots simmering across the region. The economic impact of the two ongoing conflicts is being felt by countries in the region, many of whom comprise the global south. Hence, while interstate conflict and the defense of the country's territorial integrity and its maritime frontiers remains the raison d'etre of navies the world over, there is a blurring of lines between the effects of traditional conflict and the impact of non-traditional threats, which has led to navies getting increasingly involved in ensuring good order at sea. It was the scourge of piracy in the Horn of Africa around 2008 that initiated a major thrust on developing a coordinated response to all the emerging threats at sea. A number of multinational frameworks were established in the Western Indian Ocean to support this anti-piracy effort. Despite that, it took more than 20 navies over 5 years to quell Somalian piracy in the Horn of Africa. Young semi-literate lads in small skiffs wielding Kalashnikovs were able to hold the global economy to ransom. The asymmetry could not have been more striking and underlined the importance of effective MDA. The Indo-Pacific includes two vast and dynamic ocean spaces, and it is beyond the capacity of any single country to ensure effective MDA. It is therefore important for nations to combine their resources through cooperative mechanisms to enable more comprehensive and accurate maritime domain awareness. The non-traditional and transnational maritime threat at sea is constantly evolving, with local navies having to expend considerable resources in addressing these, be it piracy, narcotics, smuggling, gun running, human trafficking, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, IUU, or a myriad of other criminal activities. The region is beset with political instability, poor governance, ethnic conflict, economic deprivation, loss of livelihoods, extreme weather events, etc., making these populations vulnerable to external exploitation. Crime syndicates, non-state and state-supported actors, and at times states themselves are finding innovative means to exploit the maritime spaces for the illegal activities. Over the years, there has been a considerable improvement in the regional MDA architecture. The infrastructure has been augmented, the improvement in technology has widened the means, and a shared recognition of the need for a collective response has enabled a far better understanding of MDA and consequently a more robust approach to it. In the Western Indian Ocean and the Horn of Africa itself, there is a Maritime Security Center, Horn of Africa, MSCHOA, which was set up by the EU NAVFOR. The EU has also established Primario 2, which has the Indian Ocean Regional Information System, IORIS. The Indian Ocean Commission has the MASE, Maritime Security Program, with 2 centers, the RMIFC located in Madagascar and the RCOC, Regional Center for Ocean Coordination, located in Seychelles. Coming further east, the Indian Ocean Region Information Fusion Center is located in India, and further east, there is an IFC also located in Singapore. In addition, there are piracy-related centers like RECAP, which is a Regional Cooperation Agreement on Combating Piracy and Armed Robbery, Information Sharing Center, SHADE, SHADE, and the Djibouti Code of Conduct, amongst others. The shift in the geopolitical and geoeconomic center of gravity to the Indo-Pacific and the predominantly maritime orientation of this construct has also brought with it challenges to a free and open Indo-Pacific. This region accounts for 2/3 of the global population. It generates more than 60% of the global GDP and over 50% of global trade. Its importance to the global economy has led many traditional Eurocentric organizations like the European Union into articulating an Indo-Pacific strategy. And its member states like Germany, the Netherlands, France, also have brought out their own Indo-Pacific strategies, as have the UK and Canada. The underlying theme of all these strategies is their concern for the security and safety of their trade and their other maritime interests in the region. The Indian Ocean is unique in 2 respects. Firstly, it connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And secondly, it is bound by some of the world's most strategic choke points, which are vulnerable to disruption with serious repercussions for the global economy. In fact, the Indian Navy's recent counter-piracy efforts, when it safely escorted ships through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Western Indian Ocean, earned it global appreciation. In fact, at one stage, 12 major Indian warships were deployed in the region to counter this resurgence in Somali piracy. MDA is also now an integral part of the maritime security agenda of regional multilateral organizations like IORA, ADMM+, East Asia Summit, BIMSTEC, the Colombo Maritime Conclave, etc. Recognizing the importance of MDA in the increasingly tenuous waters of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad introduced the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness as an essential constituent of its commitment towards ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific in 2022. Its aim is to establish a comprehensive domain awareness system for monitoring maritime activities in the region, ensuring the safety of the strategic sea lines of communication, and promoting maritime cooperation amongst like-minded countries in the region. The IPMDA is still a work in progress and has the potential to substantially enhance MDA against existing and emerging challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. China's rise, its maritime brinkmanship, its intimidation of its smaller neighbors, its grey zone tactics, and its blatant disregard for international conventions has ratcheted up regional tension and the possibility of an unintended escalation at sea. Its great power contestation with the US will extend beyond just Taiwan and the Western Pacific and will spill over into the Indian Ocean, as it will seek more space to project its maritime power and, more significantly, gain access to the Atlantic Ocean. Its vast network of strategically located ports, bases, and other infrastructure projects is providing it the wherewithal and presence to shape and influence events in the region. Hence, developing an effective counter-strategy. Sorry?
Commodore Singh, excuse me, 2 minutes left, sir.
Yeah, I'll quickly run through it.
Okay,
Hence, developing an effective counter-strategy will require a focused approach towards understanding its intentions at sea through an effective and coordinated multi-dimensional capability. A very brief word on India's MDA effort. I think after the audacious attacks on Mumbai on 26 November 2008, the government of India developed a very comprehensive and coordinated coastal security structure involving all maritime stakeholders with clearly demarcated responsibilities. This construct has progressed well, but there is, of course, still room for improvement. and India appointed a National Maritime Security Coordinator in February 2022, which is a very welcome development to enable better coordination. I had couple of paragraphs on this, but I'll skip that and I'll come to another aspect of maritime domain awareness, which is not often highlighted, and that is undersea domain awareness. The oceans are less about what one sees on the surface and more about what one does not see within the depths. However, the lack of adequate understanding of the undersea domain tends to it getting overlooked in the general discourse on MDA. With humankind increasingly turning to the sea and developing various blue economy initiatives to exploit the oceans, there is a need to understand what the deep has to offer. This can only be done through extensive underwater research, seabed mapping, resource extraction, and understanding the acoustic dynamics of the ocean, which are driven by environmental conditions and can vary considerably from day to day and region to region. Exploration of the deep forms an important element of underwater domain awareness, and in the emerging maritime battle space is perhaps the most critical constituent of MDA. From a military perspective, the efficacy of submarine deployments, the credibility of sea-based strategic deterrence, and the prosecution of undersea warfare are all dependent on the knowledge of the underwater battle space. The frequent presence of Chinese research vessels carrying out underwater research in the Indian Ocean is to gather information and develop a database of oceanographic information to facilitate their future submarine deployments in the Indian Ocean in pursuance of its global maritime operations. Countries such as China, with their distinct lack of ethical consideration, are busy weaponizing public goods and have regularly disrupted various national infrastructures. So it would not be surprising if in the future they would focus on creating a disruption below the surface of the sea by either disturbing underwater pipelines, as we've seen happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or damaging undersea cables over which more than 90% of the internet travels. Hence, we have to keep this in careful consideration when developing our UDA capability. To conclude, the subject of MDA is almost as vast as the oceans themselves. The importance of the ocean and its vulnerability to a wide spectrum of traditional, non-traditional, and transnational threats has highlighted the importance of MDA as a cornerstone of maritime security. Therefore, to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific and an adherence to a rules-based order at sea, effective MDA is a 21st century strategic imperative for the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Singh. Next up is Professor Ian Hall from the Greater Brisbane area, where it seems to be raining heavily and is impeding the start of play. Up to you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. So, yes, indeed, yesterday the rain stayed away mostly, but today we've got a fair amount of rain disrupting this rather important test match. So, look, thank you very much to the organisers, the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, for this invitation to speak today. I should say that I'm I tend to work more on India's foreign policy, security policy, and the Indo-Pacific more broadly, rather than on maritime security. But maritime security has become so salient and so important to Australia and also to Australia's relationships across the region that I think all of us who have any kind of interest in the Indo-Pacific broadly have been engaged in this wider subject of maritime security. And I have been involved as well in a project that's been sponsored by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which we've called Blue Security, which has been producing a whole series of papers about how to improve maritime security, very broadly conceived across this region. So what I thought I would do is perhaps just offer some comments on Australia's approach to maritime security as it's evolving. It's a very broad subject, of course, but I thought I would kind of give some inputs on this particular topic that might chime with some of the other comments that will be made by others across this session. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why maritime security matters to Australia, what Australia is doing, and what more it might be doing, and what it might not be doing that it should be doing indeed as well. So maritime security, as I've already suggested, is hugely important to Australia. Really, partly because of Australia's maritime real estate, if you like. Australia has the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. It's about 10 million or so square kilometres. That's actually larger than the landmass of Australia. It's about 7.7 million square kilometres. It has the largest search and rescue zone in the world at about 53 or so million square kilometres, which is a very large chunk of the globe. And Australia is dependent, obviously, on maritime trade. It's dependent on maritime trade for its energy resources in particular, but also for our exports of iron ore, coal, and other kinds of commodities that we produce in quantities, and of course sell across the Indo-Pacific region, trade into that region. Australia is also, of course, interested in a whole range of other maritime challenges. So in the last 20, 30 years or so, a variety of transnational crime issues across this region, including people smuggling, drug trafficking. We've just had a case of some quite sophisticated submarines coming across the Pacific, trying to deliver cocaine to our shores on the east coast of Australia. We're also concerned, obviously, with piracy, with illegal and unregulated fishing as well, and with a range of other transnational crime challenges in this space. And two, we are concerned, obviously, with climate, but I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. The major strategic challenge that has pushed maritime security back onto the agenda, however, of course, is China, which has already been hinted at in the first presentation. So China's increasingly muscular presence across the Indo-Pacific, its expanding footprint, not just in terms of its military, it's also its coast guard, its fishing fleets, its maritime militia, and so on, is a concern to Australia. Its activities in terms of mapping the seabed, in terms of prospecting for seabed mining, for example, its potential impact on the environment, all of those things are of concern to Australia. Australia is interested too in the sea lanes communication across this region, and since 2020, increasingly concerned about the prospects of economic coercion by China of Australia, affecting us in a range of different ways. And we've already experienced a degree of coercion in terms of trade sanctions, and we could look forward to other kinds of coercion in the future as well, in terms of the disruption of our trade or of our energy supplies, or indeed now, of course, again, which was hinted in the first presentation too, of data flows, seabed cables, and so on and so forth. We've already seen some disruption to seabed cables in the South China Sea, not clearly attributed to any particular actor, but we've already seen some disruption in that area. And then, of course, we've seen natural disasters impacting connectivity, famously, of course, in Tonga a few years ago out in the Pacific as well. So we have a sense of what the impact of all of that could be. Australia is, of course, interested too in the sovereignty claims that China has advanced, particularly the claims in the South China Sea, which it began to advance with some energy after 2009. So these challenges have forced Australia to focus much more on its maritime security, and particularly on the harder edged areas of maritime security over the last decade and a half or so. And that's meant that since we had a defense white paper in 2009 as well, which refocused a lot of our attention and energy onto our Navy again. And there was consciousness then that our Navy was too small, too limited, at around 50 or so ships that are, we don't have a proper Coast Guard, but we do have a Maritime Border Command and a range of vessels and capabilities in that area. But the connections between the various different departments and agencies in that particular space are complicated. We then are upgrading our capabilities, but those capabilities are being upgraded relatively slowly. So a lot of focus is on the investments in nuclear propelled submarines and other kinds of advanced technologies, but arguably important too are the offshore patrol vessels that we're acquiring, the new frigates that we're acquiring in the early 2030s from the UK. The new general purpose frigates will hopefully will be ordered pretty soon, up to 11 of those, again, arriving in the early 2030s. The optionally crewed vessels, which are going to be ordered at some point in the next few years. as well as a range of other sort of smaller capabilities that Australia is trying to add into the mix. So a huge number of challenges that Australia has got here, and our capabilities are limited. Beyond this, of course, Australia has been extremely active and energetic in defense diplomacy across the region, both in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific in particular, but also with India, with a focus on the Bay of Bengal and that space in the Indian Ocean region, and working much more carefully and deeply with allies and partners across this whole region on a range of different things, including interoperability, including working on some high-end capabilities like anti-submarine warfare, but also, of course, working on maritime domain awareness as well. And of course, we can't forget the fact that Australia has been doing a lot of work in capacity building and training across the region with various different bodies involved in that, from working with regional countries on issues of maritime law and trying to improve awareness and understanding of those kinds of challenges, right the way through to some of the technical training as well. So let me just highlight a few things that Australia has been doing, and then I'll try and, just in the last minute I've got left, speak to some of the critiques of Australia's approach at the moment. So Australia is right across the Indo-Pacific engaged in various different programs. It's involved, and perhaps I think Tess may speak to this as well, in the Pacific Maritime Security Program, in trying to provide Pacific nations with boats, with maintenance and sustainment for those boats, training advisors, providing air surveillance, improving communications, all sorts of things that are really important to allowing those Pacific countries to be able to regulate fishing in their areas and to regulate other kinds of activities in their very extensive EEZs as well. Australia is involved too, of course, in the Indo-Pacific Partnership, Maritime Domain Awareness, the provision of data and information across this area. And it's involved, it's just launched a new maritime partnership scheme in Southeast Asia. It was announced just earlier on this year, that is going to assist Southeast Asian states with mapping. It's going to get the Australian Border Force and other agencies to talk to their counterparts more across Southeast Asia and provide advice, information, best practice, a whole range of things like that. But it also contains a range of initiatives concerning things like environmental protection, particularly around reefs and so on. So again, taking a kind of holistic approach to this maritime security issue. And last but not least, of course, Australia is closely involved in the Australia-India Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, partnership as well, which could well prove to be quite an important initiative in that space. Now, what are the persistent critiques of Australia here? Well, there are three, really. I've already spoken to the question of capability. We have very limited capabilities just in terms of ships and boats, but we also have limited capabilities in terms of people. Our workforce challenges are in some ways just as important as our equipment challenges. Also, one of the other persistent critiques is that we lack an overarching strategy. We have no one single national security strategy. We have no one single maritime security strategy either. And that means that in principle, at least, there's not enough coordination across the 25 or so federal agencies and departments that have some responsibility over maritime security in Australia. And the last thing is that arguably we're moving too slowly on some things that are quite important, things that I haven't mentioned, for example, like our sovereign merchant fleet, something that was proposed several years ago. We're only at a pilot stage now, and we're only looking at acquiring 12 ships and fitting them out, getting them working and so on as well. And the last thing that I should mention too, and I suspect that others might pick this up too as well, is that we're neglecting the climate dimension to all of these various different things. So I'm probably stop there. I think I've used up my time. And again, I'm very grateful to the organizers for being involved in this event today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hall. Dr. John Bradford of the Yokosuka Council. Floor is yours, sir. John, you got it. Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Great.
Hi. Just took me a second to find the microphone. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with so many friends and speaking to such a broad audience. Let me echo what others have said and just compliment NICE for the very, very nice job that they do. I'm always impressed by the energy to which they assert themselves and bring things together. Now, what I wanted to talk to today is the challenges involved with expanding maritime security cooperation in the region. If you forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit focused on Southeast Asia because that's where my examples are, and I would even say where the heart of my expertise lies. That said, I think most of the things I'm talking about can be easily broadened to speak to the wider Indo-Pacific, noting that both the Indian Ocean, the Northeast Asia, and the Pacific area all have their own peculiarities. So it's not 100% true, but I think generally speaking, the trends I'm going to talk about are similar. So if I was to give this talk a title, it would be The Shrinking Prospects for Maritime Security Cooperation in Southeast Asia. I come to that title, The Shrinking Prospects, as a counterpoint to an article that I wrote, actually the very first academic journal article that I published 19 years ago, called The Growing Prospects for Maritime Security Cooperation in Southeast Asia. And I think that in those 20 years, so in that article, I basically laid out that that cooperation was seen to be as something that has been historically difficult in terms of the maritime domain in Southeast Asia, but we were on the precipice of a vast expansion of that growth. I think that the postulation that I put down there has pretty much borne out. There has been a general explosion in growth in the, say, 10 to 15 years after that, but it slowed down considerably. And I'm getting the sense that right now we are at a turning point where not only has the growth of cooperation plateaued, but it may actually be getting more difficult, more challenging, and we maybe see more fragmentation, and even in some places, steps back. So if I could first talk about, what has happened since 2005 to now is a great deal of expanded international cooperation in the maritime domain. If you look at the ASEAN Maritime Outlook, largely a stock-taking exercise that lists the various things that have taken place within ASEAN and the maritime domain, you can see that there's more than 50 different ASEAN-led mechanisms and organizations and activities focused on maritime cooperation. That number would have been less than a dozen 20 years ago. As was already mentioned by the previous speaker, a number of new organizations have started in the last 20 years, or they were just starting 20 years ago, and they've really taken root and established themselves. For example, RECAP, formally established in 2004, so 20 years ago, and very much established place in our constellation of cooperation now. The various different information fusion centers that were mentioned in Southeast Asia, the most significant being the one at the Changi in Singapore, but also the ones in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. These are all new. These are all less than 20 years old. We've had a proliferation of naval exercises, which are multilateral. CCAT started around 20 years ago and has grown to go beyond just a small number of navies to a large number of navies and coast guards. It's grown beyond Southeast Asia to include much of the Indian Ocean region participating and some European partners. Indonesia launched the multinational exercise, Komodo. Australia's Kakadu has expanded, etc. We also see trilateral organizations growing up. Back in 2004, the Malacca Strait patrols were somewhat bespoke and new. We've seen that those have been replicated to some extent, the borrowing of the mechanisms, the borrowing of the ideas to form the trilateral arrangements, which are at work in the Sulu and Sulawesi Seas. And we see a rise of coast guards with multinational drills. Without a formal organization, we have formal organizations like the Global Heads of Coast Guard Summit hosted in Japan, and the HACMs, also less than 20 years old. So these are all places where we've seen tremendous success. But in the last year, there were three different things I've looked at, which made me say, not only is it getting harder, but we may actually be taking a step back. So the first of them was the great difficulty that Indonesia had during its year of ASEAN chairmanship, putting together what was being labeled as the first ASEAN joint military exercise. This event eventually happened, but it was questionable for some time because some of the ASEAN member states objected. and the location of the exercise, which was meant to be a maritime-centric joint military exercise in the South China Sea, was ultimately part of the negotiation between the ASEAN members, relocated well within Indonesia's archipelagic waters. Now, this should not have been hard. This should have been low-hanging fruit. ASEAN has had naval exercises twice before. And those naval exercises, although called naval exercises, involve joint forces. And the ADDM Plus has had joint maritime exercises in the South China Sea. So really, the types of forces that were involved and the location, the South China Sea, are not new. Yet somehow it became too hard. And in the end, in order for it to happen, it had to be moved, as I said, and de-scoped, depublicized to some extent. The next example I've been thinking about is the difficulties of developing an ASEAN Coast Guard Forum. So the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum, although ASEAN as name is not institutionalized as a part of ASEAN, another initiative that Indonesia took during its chairmanship year. And I note that this ASEAN Coast Guard Forum has now met twice, and leadership has been transferred to the Philippines. So it's definitely moving slowly in the right direction. But whether or not it will be ultimately institutionalized by ASEAN remains an open question. Now, why would this be a problem? ASEAN has all kinds of multinational ASEAN-wide law enforcement cooperation. All of the heads of ASEAN Coast Guard members already meet together in wider organizations, as I mentioned before, both global and Asia-wide. So why is it difficult for the heads of the ASEAN Coast Guards to get together and formally do so? It should be low-hanging fruit. And then finally, the one case study I was thinking about that I've actually published the most lengthy paper on, in cooperation with Blue Security that he had mentioned recently, was the challenges the Quad has been having moving ahead in the maritime domain. It has definitely made progress, so I don't want to say it hasn't done anything. But it has not been particularly active on the South China Sea. And IPMDA, which should be very easy, smart countries with a lot of resources that understand the maritime domain, are very, very slowly moving ahead in this area. And so why is it so slow? After all, maritime was one of the three pillars the Quad first announced when it came back together several years ago. And yet, in this several years of moving, the progress has been incremental, even glacial. So, I would think if I go back to the framework I used in that article in 2020, I focused on why cooperation was getting easier through a factor of both first looking at threats and then looking at the factors which are enabling the cooperation. So in the threat dynamic, the threats that were identified in that article were territorial disputes, terrorism, insurgency, transnational maritime crime. All of these so territorial disputes are becoming, are still there and are becoming more fraught. Transnational crime has become worse, if not better. Terrorism and insurgency, perhaps getting a bit better. Perhaps that's been pushed back. But then we add environmental crimes, and we add natural disasters, which are becoming more and more difficult. So in terms of threats, the situation is becoming worse and becoming more demanding of international cooperation. So one hypothesis might be that terrorism and insurgency are something special that require international cooperation. But that's not where my instinct goes. I think it has more to do with the dynamics that were driving cooperation back in that period. And in that period, I identified 5 factors as having changed in recent years, which were enabling the cooperation. 1, relaxing sovereignty sensitivities. 2, the alignment of extra-regional powers. 3, the growth of norms related to cooperation. 4, improving state resources. And 5, the prioritization of maritime affairs. So all of those are the things which were changing in the region to enable more cooperation. I would argue that that if you look at those factors, you can see why cooperation is becoming much more difficult, because in all 5 of those cases, all 5 of those factors, the situation has either remained static over the last 20 years or is changed in such a way to make cooperation more difficult. So first, relaxing sovereignty sensitivities. In 20 years ago, in the post-Cold War era, the states of Southeast Asia were doing well. They were starting to be able to work with each other on sensitive issues, and we had clear, positive international litigation over features and borders. Today, in the era of great power competition, what's been left is becoming fought over more and more drastically than before. And I would argue that the China factor is making other sensitivities more sensitive. So when China uses its gray zone activities and threatens claims in the South China Sea, it raises a nationalist backlog, and it makes it more difficult for Malaysia or the Philippines, et cetera, to deal with their other sovereignty issues with their other more friendly neighbors, because they have to take a national stance that these waters are ours. And they lose flexibility. Second, and I think this one is obvious, it's probably the most important factors, is there is no longer an alignment of extra-regional powers. Whereas 20 years ago, broadly, China, the United States, India, all of the extra-regional powers, they were all motivated to improve the safety of the maritime domain. They all wanted to see terrorism, piracy, crime pushed back, and an area which is safer. So now we see the opposite. First of all, certain states are actually deliberately making the maritime domain more dangerous. And then second, there's a zero-sum game mentality developing, where every piece of cooperation, every move is seen as somehow detrimental to the opponent, making cooperation more difficult. Three, cooperation norms on the decline. I think that this is where the fact that ASEAN is somewhat in crisis undermines cooperation in the maritime domain. The differences between Cambodia and the new states, the inability to make decisions, and then obviously this is all highlighted most powerfully by the crisis and the situation with Myanmar. So the idea that ASEAN naturally must cooperate more has gone in reverse, as ASEAN has found it more and more difficult to find cooperation. Improving state resources. This is the one positive area. The states of Southeast Asia do indeed have more resources to put towards the maritime domain. And then finally, prioritization. While the states of Southeast Asia have given more priority to the maritime domain over the last 20 years, this is ironically causing a bit of a backwards movement. Whereas 20 years ago, the prioritization meant the states would get on with it. They would diplomatically work together. Now the priority, it's rising priority exactly because of the sensitivities. So therefore, the prioritization is maybe giving policy makers more space, more resources, but it's also raising the stakes such that cooperation has become more difficult. I'm sure I've gone over on my time, so I will leave out a conclusion and wrap up there. Turn my microphone back to mute and hand it back to the chair. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, John. And our next speaker is Dr. Tess Newton-Cain of the Frank Lowy Institute now, I gather. Yes, I have only one comment to make there. Frank Lowy, still alive, must be extremely happy that Australia actually got a World Cup in soccer. I'll give it to you now.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I will correct that slightly. I'm formerly a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute, but that was quite some time ago. I'm now currently principal consultant with Sustinio, and I'm also an adjunct at the Griffith Asia Institute, where I often catch up with Ian to talk about a whole bunch of things. So thank you again to the organisers for the invitation to be part of this discussion. Maritime security is still quite new to me in terms of where I've focused my attention over the last 25 years or so, but it's increasingly important in the work that I do. And as I think I said to somebody the other day, geopolitics is everybody's business now. So we're all doing geopolitics. So I'll be focusing very much on the Pacific Islands region. So it will be quite narrow from that point of view, but hopefully it will add to your thinking about the whole of the region. I will start by saying that the Indo-Pacific framing doesn't sit comfortably with many of the thinkers and strategists and decision makers in the Pacific Islands region. Asia Pacific didn't sit comfortably, and Indo-Pacific doesn't sit comfortably either. But that's, I can talk a bit more about that later. So let me just set the clock so that I know how I'm going for time. As we know, Pacific Island countries have within that collective, they are responsible for a vast swathe of the ocean. About 10% of the world's total ocean surface is contained within the EEZs of 23 Pacific Island countries. So increasingly, we tend not to think of these countries as small island states. They may have small populations. Papua New Guinea is something of an exception. But in terms of the real estate over which they exercise stewardship, they are better referred to as large ocean states or big ocean states. And increasingly in Pacific discourse, we use the term blue ocean continent to kind of reflect the centrality of the ocean to Pacific identity, Pacific economy, and Pacific security. So maritime security is a concept that can take many forms, as we've already talked about. So that can include hard security issues like military modernization, island building, freedom of navigation, maritime surveillance, grey zone tactics, and maritime militia. All of those are, they're not specific to the Pacific, they are common across the region. But maritime security also encompasses other topics which we have mentioned and I think are possibly sometimes more significant for Pacific Island countries. So they would include illegal fishing, piracy, terrorism, energy, trade, international law, irregular migration, biosecurity, climate change, telecommunications, transnational crime, and cybersecurity. In the case of sea level rise, security is sought from the encroaching maritime domain itself in numerous parts of the Pacific Islands region. And all of this is reflected or is encapsulated in what we saw documented in the Boy Declaration of 2018, where the Pacific Islands leadership came together to stipulate that as far as security goes in the region, firstly, climate change is the preeminent security threat faced by the region, but also that when it comes to thinking about security in the Pacific, we're focused very much on an expanded concept of security, with human security being very much at the forefront. And that applies in the maritime domain, just as it does everywhere else. So if we look at the Pacific Islands Forum Security Outlook Report for 2022-2023, this builds on what was in the Boy Declaration and the associated action plan for that declaration. And it highlights what it refers to as new challenges, which are linked to global economic instability and geostrategic competition. So these things that are happening in other parts of the world, as we've already heard at the beginning, they have an impact on everyone. And that includes in the Pacific Island region, which is sometimes seen as being possibly a bit remote or somehow removed from what's going on elsewhere in the world. So that report, in particular reference to maritime security, saw value in extending cooperation with what's referred to as the Pacific Quad. So that comprises Australia, New Zealand, the USA, and France. So they are seen as principal partners when it comes to maritime security in the region. But as I'll come to in a little while, they're no longer the only ones. We're seeing an increase in the partners in that space. The report confirms that the maritime security intersects with other security domains, those that were identified in the Boy Declaration. Again, climate change, transnational crime, geostrategic competition, environmental security, and human security. So if we look at the declaration plan from the Boy Declaration, the action plan that accompanies the Boy Declaration, this is what the Pacific leaders, the Pacific Islands Forum leadership wants to do in relation to maritime security. So it talks about the need to enhance capacity of regional law enforcement agencies to monitor and secure maritime borders, combat illegal fishing, and prevent maritime piracy and smuggling. Now, this is a big challenge for anybody, It's a big challenge when you have a huge segment of the ocean to do those things in, whether you're doing that on a national basis or whether you're working together as a collective. And as we see in other parts of the world, in the Pacific, these things exist side by side. So there is work being done at a national basis, but there's also work done by the Pacific Island countries as a collective. At the political level, that operates through the Pacific Islands Forum. At the technical level, it operates largely through the Forum Fisheries Agency, but there are new agencies that are coming in behind to support that. For example, the Pacific Fusion Center, which is based in Vanuatu, that's a relatively new entrant into this space. But the FFA has been around for much longer, and it's based in Honiara in Solomon Islands. And its mandate is to empower its members to take collective and national action for sustainable use of offshore fisheries within their AEZs. Across the members and the partners, there are 17 nations. Now, I think it's important to focus on fisheries for a couple of reasons. One is that the whole issue of IUU is obviously a really significant issue for these countries, particularly in terms of economic security. And the other is that what we're seeing and what we'll continue to see is that given that FFA already has an established presence and an established set of relationships and established infrastructure, that it's increasingly being used as a focal point for other aspects of maritime security, particularly when it comes to surveillance of the maritime domain in the region. So at FFA, they have a couple of aerial surveillance program. There's one that's been in place for a while and one that's relatively new, which is referred to as the Enhanced Aerial Surveillance Program. And they also have a vessel monitoring system. So all of these things are in place, and they're largely well received. I think the biggest issue there is the resources constraint versus the hugeness of the task, which is that it's very hard to provide as much aerial surveillance as everyone would like. And there are also some issues about how the information is then shared back to individual countries and how they can make best use of that data. So just in terms of, just for those who aren't aware, the significance of the work of the FFA, in 2023, 1.38 million tons of fish were taken from waters that are governed by members of the FFA. That's predominantly tuna, and that's worth $2.9 billion US. And it provides revenue to member governments to the tune of $470 million US. And it supports 25,000 plus jobs across the region. So it's an incredibly important part of what goes on in the Pacific. It has very important economic impacts, but increasingly it's very politically important as well. So one of the issues that the Pacific Islands leadership has identified is this increase in the rise of geopolitics and what that means, and in particular in the maritime space. So with another hat on, I co-lead a project which is investigating the rise of defense diplomacy in the Pacific Islands region. It covers 5 separate countries, and we've tracked the data, we've tracked the number of engagements that can be described as defense diplomacy over a 5-year period from 2018 to 2023. Now, within that data set, there are, I think, 13 categories of engagement, of which maritime security is one, and is relatively small compared to some of the others. But in that subset of the data, we can see that there's been a massive increase in the engagement from partners. So in 2018, we identified 1 engagement that we described as maritime security, and in 2023, that had increased to 13. So the largest contributing partner of this type of engagement over that 5-year period was Australia, followed by the USA. Now, to bring my remarks to a close, I wish to draw on some work done by my co-lead for that project, Associate Professor Anna Poles at Massey University. She presented earlier this year on the growing contest for influence, maritime security and governance challenges in the Pacific. So she makes a couple of really important points. When it comes to how Pacific leaders and the Pacific strategic community needs to be working with maritime security, it's important to recognize that this is intrinsically geopolitical. It's about power projection and resources. And this is particularly important for leaders and policymakers who are managing relationships, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, with partners that are seeking to support their work. This increased activity from partners who are looking to project presence and cultivate influence, it has increased, and we expect it to continue increasing. There's no sign of that tailing off in the short to medium term. So, for example, we've seen China register 26 Coast Guard vessels with the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, who will be making their presence felt, no doubt, in the next little while. We're seeing an increased presence of US Coast Guard vessels, and often they come with ship rider agreements. So they're spending more time in the region. They're working with more countries than they have done previously. And we will also, further to the most recent PALM dialogue between Japan and Pacific Island countries, we will see an entry of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force into the arena, which is an innovation. We haven't seen that previously. Now, all of this is not new in the Pacific. This need to manage a multiplicity of partners. It's more than it ever has been. It's increasingly complex. It does mean that transaction costs can become very draining on resource-constrained economies and small administrations. It does mean that there are the need to balance interests of particular partners. A number of countries in the region are non-aligned countries, including Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. So they are seeking to maintain a non-aligned position, and they adhere to a foreign policy based on being friends to all and enemies to none. Obviously, that creates opportunities for them, some of which they are making very good use of, but it also can create problems, and it can create the opportunity for conflict. There are also other concerns in civil society about an increased militarization of the region, which is something around which there are a number of sensitivities, particularly in countries like Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, and Fiji, and across the region more generally. We've seen most recently Prime Minister Ramboka of Fiji want to put forward this idea of the Pacific being an ocean of peace or a zone of peace, and we've yet to see what that will look like. I'm going to leave it there. I haven't talked much about the patrol boats that Ian mentioned, but I'm happy to address that further if it comes up in questions. Thank you for giving me that time.
No, thank you, Tess, and thank you for bringing up the security dilemma of small countries, which doesn't have to be about aircraft carriers, submarines, but about something as mundane yet vital as fishing. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Abhijit Singh of the Observer Research Foundation, whose writings on aircraft carriers I read avidly.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. It's at the outset, I'm going to thank the Nepal Institute and Pramod for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. Maritime security can always be a complicated thing to discuss because there's multiple strands and floating in different directions. There's nothing very common between, IUU fishing, non-traditional side, and say, fighting China in the Indian Ocean or perhaps in the South China Sea. So there's always different priority areas. But what I thought today I'd do is to make a set of brief remarks on some of the areas in the Indo-Pacific region that that call for more debate and that are contested. I will preface my remarks by saying that a lot of what has been said on this panel and also some of the very interesting panels yesterday, I completely agree with. For instance, let me just start by saying that when Commodore AJ points to the importance of maritime domain awareness, I am completely in agreement. I think maritime domain awareness is important because it is about foreknowledge of the threats that are there in the maritime domain. And it is about optimizing effort. You don't need to spend too much on doing too much if you just have knowledge of what threat is in which theater and what needs to be done to combat it. I think Yan is absolutely right about the importance of capacity building. It doesn't get the importance that it deserves because it's somehow maritime security is all about, is seen to be associated with more kinetic movement than things like, providing the basic capacity to your partners. And I think Dr. Cain is right about the fact that IUU fishing does not get the importance that it deserves. I will also agree with John when he says that the security order is fragmented and we need to do much more on things like IPOI, IPMDA, all of that. But my talk today or my remarks today are really not about these things because I'm in agreement with all that has been said. What I wish to point out is that there are inconsistencies in the Indo-Pacific framework that prevent us somehow from achieving our goals, and that there is a gap between what is proposed and what is practiced. So vision and implementation somehow don't sort of come together very well. So in that sense, what I'm going to say is a bit of a constructive critique of the Indo-Pacific. The first thing that I wish to point out that there is a dichotomy in the narratives that surround the Indo-Pacific. There is this dual idea. Conceptually, the Indo-Pacific is seen as a single integrated space. You look at it from a geopolitical lens, from a geoeconomic lens. Of course, there are undeniable interconnections. However, when you look at it from an operational standpoint, these are two very different theaters, the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific. And the reason they are fundamentally different is that the Pacific is still today the theater of territorial conflict and sovereign contestation. Look at what's happening in Taiwan, where the Chinese send about 30 warships to surround that island. Look at Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And also what's happening in the Southwestern Pacific, the posturing and counter posturing between China, the US, and some of the US allies, but also in the Indian Ocean region. If you look at it, this is a space that is primarily still about non-traditional security challenges. Piracy, IUU fishing, climate change. There's very little discussion around China's, other than India, about China's perceived aggression. And so there is this. There is a bit of a disagreement among those that say that the Indo-Pacific is completely homogenized, in that the security challenges in both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean region are quite similar, and those that believe that they are fundamentally different. I will point out to you that after the war in Ukraine, these differences, and of course what's happening in the South China Sea, these differences that we see in the Pacific and Indian Ocean have actually been heightened. For developed nations, somehow there is this impression that the Indian Ocean has reverted to more of its economic function, which is to be a highway for trade, for energy, and for resources. So the belief is that the route to prosperity passes through the Indian Ocean, but as far as maritime operations are concerned, the Pacific remains the primary theater of geopolitical importance and consequence. The second observation that I need to make is that non-traditional security challenges are essentially what create the demand for maritime security. But somehow maritime governance does not get the same importance that, say, issues of humanitarian security or transnational challenges, constabulary security get. Dr. Cain mentioned IUU fishing. I would like to reiterate that it does not get the focus that it deserves. If you look at some of the littoral states, the problem is not a lack of capacity or law enforcement capacity. Rather, the problem is that many of these states have not been able to align their domestic legislation with international regulations. And some of these states are exploiting the ambiguities in the UNCLOS to proffer state-specific interpretations that serve their narrow interests. So it's not as if there is great agreement, consensus on how we can move ahead on maritime governance. Every state tends to have its own interpretations, its own manner in which it decides to govern its maritime, the maritime commons. A similar governance deficit one can see in the areas of marine pollution, seabed mining, and submarine cables. That is, again, a new issue that has just come up just in the past few years. But there's no clarity on what we should do to secure these undersea cables. So also with resource management, biodiversity conservation just does not get the importance that it deserves, because we are all talking about either humanitarian resource challenges, or we are talking about traditional state-on-state threats. There is definitely a disagreement when it comes to the prioritization that we need to give to these challenges. My third comment would be on the fragmented security order or the fragmented security architecture that John touched upon briefly. I will say that that this is an issue that confronts decision makers. Is that while there is broad consensus that security needs to be collective, it needs to be cooperative, but there's little agreement on how much security is needed to forge a practical security architecture. For instance, the political class will give you no directions on how much cooperation, to what specific ends, to what degree. And that's because there is always an opportunity cost associated with maritime security that most often we desist from discussing. For instance, if India were to develop a very close relationship with the US, and this has happened just in the past few years, the Russians have gotten close with the Chinese and have done maritime security exercises with Pakistan. The fact that we are still buying a lot of equipment, India is still buying a lot of equipment from Russia, means that in the Trump administration, there were talks about India being subjected to CAATSA sanctions. So the point I want to make is that security does have an implication for your broader cooperation with other partners, and therefore there is sometimes a reluctance to go the full distance and do security cooperation in a way that will help you achieve your goals in a more holistic manner. There's only certain areas that you identify, and there's only certain areas that you move forward in. My fourth comment, and this would actually be my last comment, is that the future of maritime security, in my opinion, is in the non-traditional sector. But beyond the non-traditional sector, it's actually with what's happening with climate change and what is happening with technology. So, for example, if you look at the rising sea levels that are now threatening the existence of low-lying nations like Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and you will realize how much of a threat this is for those countries and communities, because their very existence is being threatened by climate change. There's large-scale coastal erosion happening. There's extreme weather events. They are disrupting livelihoods and creating unprecedented regional instability. And I would also posit that climate change-induced migration is in the future going to place enormous stress on maritime law enforcement and border management. And this is an issue that we've not taken seriously enough. We need to talk about it. The second issue that, again, needs to get much more emphasis than it does presently is that there are advances being made in unmanned assets, UUVs, underwater assets, UAVs, and AI-driven surveillance that is going to impact and transform naval warfare. If we just look at what's happened in the Russia-Ukraine war, a nation with no navy has actually managed to subdue a nation with one of the largest navies in the Black Sea. And so this is something that we definitely need to be cognizant of. I think that we still don't have the doctrines. We've not been able to overhaul our doctrines in a way that we can account for these big changes that are happening in the fighting procedures and in the technology that is coming in. Lastly, I want to point out there is a blurring of civil military boundaries. We talk about China's gray zone operations, we talk about China's militia presence, but really the graying is happening in a way that today even a civilian, a non-combatant, can actually be involved in combatant operations just by being able to surveil, by being able to be a part of that scenario in which you are trying to subdue an adversary. So that blurring of the lines between civil and military is something that should create some concern, and we've got to get ready for the future in which these challenges are going to be more vexed than they are today. With that, I'm going to stop. Thank you. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I know. It's just reminded me. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Divya Rai of the Delhi Policy Group. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. For a change, I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
No, sorry, we can't. You got the share icon, right?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay,
yeah.
now
Is it
now,
visible
now
now?
it's saying, yeah, now it's visible. Thank you.
So thank you so much, the organizers, for inviting me to this very interesting panel. It's always a great challenge to keep up with the impressive lineup of speakers, but being a last speaker also have its advantages, that knowing the fact that I can relax, that everyone has covered most part of my presentation, so I can just reinforce the themes that we have already explored. So I'll be presenting on growing threats in the Indo-Pacific region and India's maritime focus. So let me start by saying that, as mentioned by all the speakers, that the geostrategic and the geoeconomic center of gravity in the world is definitely shifted around the Indo-Pacific, or you can say towards the Asian, African, and the Pacific islands. I know there are also focuses on Europe, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and also in the West Asia, which is happening right now. Especially the Syria is going to be a new outlook, and we don't know which way Syria is going to go. So, amid the endless conflict in Europe, the uncertain outcome of Gaza dispute, and the instability plaguing the Red Sea, the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean dynamics has emerged as an enduring constant in our geopolitical turbulent world. So Indo-Pacific region has emerged as world's most dynamic geopolitical zone and is the center of gravity of most of the economic as well as strategic interests. But it also a pre-existing international tension. Indo-Pacific faces both traditional amplification. So if you talk about the current dynamics, we are witnessing a significant increase in geopolitical competition due to the marine resources and influences. And due to these tensions, competition among the nation has actually led to emergence of various regional security architecture. And this is becoming more and more relevant as the region play a hotspot to a few security hotspot in the region. So some of the key security hotspots in the region are maritime disputes between the states bordering the South China Sea, East China Sea, and definitely there is Taiwan conflict. And the most recent is the Red Sea conflict, Houthis attack on the merchant vessels. So I'll just briefly touch upon all these conflicts. So the South China Sea, let's start with the hot topic. So countries have wrangled over the territory in the South China Sea for centuries, but the tensions have grown in the recent years. This region, as known to everyone, is marked by overlapping territorial claims from multiple nations, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, And China's assertive actions, such as island building and military presence, have definitely escalated the tensions and prompted regional responses. Major standoff can be clearly seen between China, Philippines, China, Malaysia, and China, Vietnam. So, starting with China, Philippines, in the recent years, the territorial dispute between Philippines and China have led to a contentious relationship. Unlike other Southeast Asian countries, Philippines has publicly pushed back against China's overlapping claims in the South China Sea. And this is clearly seen upon when President Marcos Jr. resumed office in 2022, where he rejected the conciliatory stance which was taken by his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, and due to his aggressive approach and US's presence and support to Philippines, China and Philippines vessels have engaged in multiple collision and face-offs near three major flashpoints. One is Shabina Shoal, second Thomas Shoal, and the Scabarburg Shoal. The recent Chinese action in the South China Sea have also threatened lives of Filipino fishermen. The latest clash, which happened on June 17, which resulted in injuries to many Philippines Navy sailors, one of them who lost a thumb. And Chinese Coast Guard also were accused of seizing firearms as well as damaging the lifeboat on Philippine vessels, which was a resupplying troop on a military remote outpost at the shoal. And recently, last month only, the tension has escalated with the introduction of two maritime laws, which is Philippines Maritime Zone Act and the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, which was introduced recently, and which sparked a diplomatic protest between both the countries. Following the enactment of the law, China also published a 16 geographic coordinate of baselines around the Scabarburg Shoal. Interestingly, the newly promulgated baseline is only confined to the Scabarburg Shoal, which is very different from China's claim in the Paracels Island. Now, the second standoff is basically between China and Vietnam. The dispute despite a close economic cooperation, China and Vietnam have struggled to diffuse tension over disputed territory in the South China Sea. Vietnam's approach toward China regarding the South China Sea has been very much consistent with the agreement on the basic principle guiding the settlement of sea-related issues that the two countries signed in 2011. But the dispute have been persistent in the recent years. The disputes involving China and Vietnam are basically Paracels Island and the Spratly Islands. Paracel Islands, which is occupied by China but is contested by Taiwan and Vietnam both. The Spratly Islands, which is claimed by all three, but Vietnam has occupied the greatest number of features. And to strengthen Vietnam's claim, Vietnam has been ramming up building of islands in the disputed South China Sea. For example, as per CSIS report, between November 2023 and June 2024, Vietnam added about 280 hectares of land across the 10 features it controls, which is more than the total land created in the previous 2 years. Surprisingly, China has reacted aggressively to building of islands by other nations, but it has shown relative tolerance towards Vietnam's island building efforts. And this may be attributed to Vietnam's non-alliance with the US, which contrasts with China's more confrontational stance with the Philippines. And the third one is China and Malaysia. Their situation remains fluid, with both nations navigating complex landscape of national sovereignty and resource competition. The major flashpoint can be seen at the James Shoal and Luconia Shoal. Recently, Chinese vessels began asserting claims over Luconia Shoal with the increased maritime militia and coast guard activities, which Malaysia considered as part of its exclusive economic zone has continued undergoing oil and gas exploration. Malaysia's current administration has never spoken of the negotiation with the Chinese as an avenue for addressing the disputes in the South China Sea. But Malaysia has instead pursued a policy of asserting sovereignty by building its own installation in the South China Sea while using the international instrument, where a protest was submitted to the UN in 2019 to defend its claim. Now, the East Sea, I think everyone is aware, that Taiwan conflict has been a critical flashpoint between China and Vietnam. A Taiwan Strait, increasing Chinese military maneuvers near Taiwan Strait, and the mention of reunification has been going around in the recent years. Especially the potential for military conflict is heightened by the frequent military drills which is conducted by China. And similar to South China Sea, East China Sea also sees the disputes primarily between China and Japan over Senkaku Island, which is administered by Japan but claimed by both China and Taiwan. The other the other major area of concern is the gray zone coercive operation in the region. Since 2012, China has aggressively engaged in gray zone operation coercive tactics that falls below the threshold of open conflict. And recently, China has also declared the reserved areas in East China Sea and Taiwan Strait during November and December, which has further escalated the tension in already contested areas. Now moving more towards the Indian Ocean region, although the Indian Ocean region has been facing mostly the non-traditional security threats such as piracy and drug smuggling and human trafficking, while the traditional threats are less prevalent in the region. However, the spillover effect of a regional conflict can be seen in the Red Sea. The situation in Red Sea has dramatically escalated, particularly the ongoing attacks by Houthis militia on the merchant vessels amid the backdrop of Israel-Hamas conflict. And these attacks have raised concern. If you look at the major attacks that has happened since November 2023, there are over 120 attacks which has happened, of which 24 vessels were struck by missiles and drone, and 2 ships sank, which can have an environmental impact in the future. While there was also loss of life, where 3 sailors lost their life and leaving multiple people for injured. Then this has raised concern about the maritime security and the implication for the global shipping routes. Although the attacks Houthis attack has acted as a catalyst, but it has also led to a notable increase in the non-traditional threats, such as piracy incidents, particularly in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean region. So far, as you can see on the slide, that on the right side, these are the piracy events that has happened since November 2023. Where you can see that MV Ruin and other vessel named Abdullah, which marked as successful pirate attacks on the commercial shipping. And these the data shows that there is a significant rise in piracy after years of relative calm. Now, the Indo-Pacific strategies, growing influence of China, and understanding the importance of the region, has prompted a lot of countries to adopt the Indo-Pacific concept. So far, a number of countries as well as the regional organizations has released the Indo-Pacific strategy, but and with the Sweden actually being the latest addition into the list. So for India, we don't have a strategy document or a white paper, but there are several policies and initiatives that covers India's maritime strategy. And India's maritime strategy is basically underpinned under SAGAR and IPOI. So India's vision for the Indo-Pacific can be summarized as open, integrated, and inclusive. Open meaning absence of any hegemonic power in the Indo-Pacific region. Inclusive, which includes cooperation, respect for sovereignty, and involvement of all the nations in promoting stability in the region. Basically, a multipolar world as well as a multipolar Asia. And based on these visions, India's approach to maritime security can be framed around 3 pillars, which is strategic deterrence, management of threats, and regional collaboration. And in that, role of Indian Navy in establishing deterrence is fundamental in its maritime strategy. While participation in multilateral forums can be crucial for enhancing regional cooperation, as well as addressing various strategic initiatives. So if you put all this thing together, there are avenues on which India's Indo-Pacific strategy is supposed to work. While some of them might be going well, and some of them might not. To summarize the entire presentation, what are the future opportunities for India in the Indo-Pacific region? So much of India's focus is on the Indian Ocean region, where it has adopted a more human-centric approach, with a focus on HADR operations and counter-piracy operations. But as the geopolitical landscape evolves, India is also positioned to play a vital role in establishing a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in the Indian Ocean region. In the same line, India can strengthen its presence in the Indian Ocean region through first, to counter China's increasing presence, India should take a lead in creating strategic bases in the region, increase naval operation, as well as establishing strategic bases in the IOR. For example, INS Jatayu and INS Kadamba and others in the future is extremely crucial for India. Second, since December 2023, Indian Navy has responded to multiple incidents which has happened in the Indian Ocean region and has played a vital role as a first responder as well as a preferred security partner in emergency situation in the Indian Ocean region. So reinforcing India's position in the IOR and ensuring that its interests are not challenged must be India's focus. Third, India's central location in the Indian Ocean provides it a significant advantage for maritime operations and influences. India's mission-based deployment have become a cornerstone of maritime strategy, which is aimed at enhancing Indian Navy's presence as well as operational readiness across the critical regions, eventually which will lead to reinforcing India as a preferred security partner among littoral states. To address the several critical deficiencies in the maritime capabilities, to implement its strategy effectively, India should increase its maritime capabilities like transport infrastructure, sea lift capacity, domestic industrial capacity, submarine capabilities, area anti-submarine warfare, ballistic missile defense on ship, and as well as emerging technologies. So lastly, the complex maritime environment in the region necessitates a proactive role from India. And India has actively participated in multilaterals that spans both IOR as well as the Indo-Pacific, facilitating a broader dialogue on shared interests and security challenges. But this multifaceted strategies require sustained efforts, collaboration with like-minded nations, execution capacity, as well as sustainability of initiatives like IPOI. IPOI is a low quest which has 7 pillars and is heavily undersubscribed. So if you ask me, there are a lot more nations who can come on board. And at the same time, with respect to Quad, there is a lot more the Quad can do. So I'll wrap it up by saying that India, by strengthening its own capabilities and fostering international cooperation through initiatives like Sagar, IPOI, Quad, it can shape a favorable maritime environment. With that, I've come to end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Divya. I'll just say a couple of things very quickly. Few years back, I did this book on naval powers in the Indian Ocean, which was all about naval force structures, firepower, doctrine, and other incredibly boring stuff like that. So it was really nice to have your ideas come across because there are non-traditional security issues. And they're also bringing up something which I think is far more important. See, when most people look at the Indo-Pacific, it's a construct coming out of Washington, London, and Brussels. And I don't recommend any of those capitals for grand strategy or any kind of future world order. The problem is going to be we don't know where Trump is headed because the US has 3 strategic challenges: China, the Middle East, and Russia. And despite all his claims that he's going to focus on China, there's good money being put in Washington that it's going to go towards the Middle East and Russia. So which then brings up, I think, the importance of this panel, because everything you have said is there is a growing body of literature, there's a growing organizational structure which can deal with the issues of the Indo-Pacific, and it can deal with it without having to reference the great powers. And I think that is a very important thing. I also think it's very hopeful because I am a lifelong optimist. And I'll end by saying one thing, because it always disappoints me when I see naval officers from the Indo-Pacific. Submarines matter. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Do we have questions? Let's see. This is to everybody who's in the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please go ahead. Or if you want to put it into the chat box, and just identify which of the speakers you would like addressing the issues. Okay, it looks like people are shy today. So let me ask one question to our to our two Australian colleagues. And John, if you like, you can also say something about this. Is there any buyer's remorse about AUKUS and the submarines? Or is the Albanese government incredibly happy with this? The Tess, Ian, John, whoever would like to, all three of you.
I'm not Australian, so I'm going to defer to Ian.
Thanks, Tess. Look, I think the answer is it's complicated. And I know that's a cop-out as well. Look, I think in the end, I remember having a very in-depth conversation with some senior, very well-respected strategic analysts in Canberra about 15 years ago. And that conversation rounded out with, in an ideal world, Australia would have nuclear-propelled submarines. Unfortunately, there is no way of getting them. For all of the demands, all of the things that we need submarines for, they would be the optimal outcome for us. AUKUS has put on the table a way of acquiring those submarines that is going to be expensive, it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult, it's uncertain, but there is at least some kind of pathway there. Of course, we have to, Australia has factored in the possibility of Trump being re-elected. It's factored in the possibility of the disruptive effects that could have on the whole program. It's also factored in the possibility that the UK could face, might put Tess on the spot on this one, as a UK citizen like me as well. The UK could face some real problems in the future as well in terms of its own submarine programs, and certainly in terms of its defense budget, which has been coming under pressure now for 20 years. So these are difficult things to do. But as a country of 27 million people, we would find it difficult to acquire these things ourselves. And it's going to be hard work. I think it's an understanding of that, at least. I should probably leave it there.
Yeah, I might just add that it's kind of quieted down now, but when the AUKUS deal was first announced, there was some quite significant concerns raised by Pacific Island leaders about the implications of AUKUS. So they were concerned, as were other countries, that they hadn't been consulted. They felt that, that it didn't marry up with Australia's protestations about, we are a Pacific family and we have it's a shared region with shared security, and that we, what I think the new term for it that we heard last week is about strategic trust. And there's also concern about what it means for Australia's ability to fully abide by the Rarotonga Treaty, which created the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. The use of nuclear-powered submarines doesn't contravene the letter of that treaty, but there are certainly some people that would argue that it contravenes the spirit of it.
Okay. John, do you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, if the question is buyer's remorse, the United States was the seller. So I think the United States is still relatively comfortable. It was a bit of a glib answer, but I think the point is that, I mean, for the United States, if it all falls apart, the downsides are that Australia might come out with less capability than it would have otherwise, because it went down a path and it has to change horses. But that was possible with the French submarines as well. And it was possible with the Collins-class submarines. So there's a little bit additional risk for the United States that its close partner and ally might come out the other side a bit less capable. But at the same time, and I think the other risk would be that the United States is giving up national secrets, but at the same time, Australia is a Five Eyes partner. It's very trusted, and to some extent, the submarine deal is enabling the push through the bureaucratic morass, which will enable transfer of other sensitive technologies. So that's largely seen as a good thing. I actually, and the final thing I'd say is, the risk was kind of put on, as mentioned, that a Trump presidency. From where I sit, that's probably the most solid corner of the triangle. I mean, Trump likes good deals, and this is a good deal. He'll probably come back, and for the United States, he'll probably come back and either do nothing or come back and he'll squeeze for a little bit extra on the margins, but it'll be a small difference. I think that what much more likely is that that alternate views on defense and spending could come into play in Australia or the UK. I'm not an expert on either one of the politics, but it's already been mentioned that these are expensive budgets for, in comparison to the United States or Japan, where I'm sitting right now, relatively small countries. And it, that's where this deal, I think, is most likely to come apart. Thanks.
Okay.
As a submariner, may I just add a perspective to the AUKUS program, please? In fact, I've always been surprised why Australia did not choose to go nuclear a lot earlier than it has, frankly speaking. I knew it was a country which has not really been in favor of nuclear power, nuclear proliferation, etc., but from a totally strategic and operational perspective, a country of Australia's size, and now with the emerging geopolitical developments in that region, I think a country of that size needs that sort of capability. Even the French program, if you really look at it, was not for the Scorpion class. It was for what they called a short fin Barracuda. And I was quite convinced that by the time the Barracuda program really materializes and matures, perhaps Australia would have taken a decision to go nuclear. And that is why they've chosen a short fin Barracuda, which could be expanded to become a Barracuda class. And that was, I think, the underlying thought process behind why France really won that contract, besides many other reasons, of course. Secondly, I think for a country that was looking for a boat that could operate 3,000 miles away and have a major time on task, a conventional submarine, even with an AIP system, was not quite the platform of choice. And I think of course, there are challenges to this program. It's long term, it's expensive. Australia has to commit some $368 billion or $1 million. I don't remember what the figure is. That's huge. And this kind of program requires a lot of political support right through. It needs across the political cross section. It needs financial support. It needs budgetary support. There will be many ups and downs in this program. I can give the Indian example. We had leased our first nuclear submarine from then erstwhile Soviet Union in 1988. And it is now that we have finally placed an order for 2 SSNs, which is 12 and 20, 36 years later. So obviously, before the program matures, there's lots of thought goes into it. The security situation is seen. But I think it's a good start. There will be ups and downs, and perhaps the program may mature later than it is expected to, may mature a little earlier than it's expected to. I'm sure something of this magnitude has been thought through quite a bit. It wouldn't be an impulsive decision that's been taken to create this capability. Australia will have to gear up. India had the advantage of having a robust civilian nuclear energy establishment. Australia doesn't have that because it's never gone nuclear in terms of nuclear power or nuclear power stations or anything. So obviously there will be challenges, but I think if you ask me personally as a submariner, I think it's a good decision, it's the right decision. And yes, the only downside to it is, for the duration of this program, what is Australia going to do to replace its Collins? Will there be a period when Australia will really be deficient in some even basic submarine capability? Because this program wouldn't have matured and the older submarines would have sort of reached the end of their service life. That's something perhaps Australia will have to look at in some other manner. That's my take on the Australian AUKUS program. For India, it augurs well. The more like-minded countries are better, have better navies, the more it benefits Indian Ocean countries, because there can be a check and balance on the PLA Navy moving into the Indian Ocean at some point in time.
Can I add my 2 cents to this very interesting discussion? So,
Please, sorry.
Yeah, I actually agree a lot with what Commodore AJ has to say. But you see, the thing is that there's recently been growing skepticism around the AUKUS deal. And I'm reminded of some of the discussions that happened a few years ago when the deal was signed, that there were the critics of this deal who were pointing out that, one, this is an exorbitant proposition for Australia, and that it somehow seems needless. And second, they pointed out that the US is struggling with its own Virginia-class submarine program, and that there is a marked slowdown in the shipbuilding yards. And it is so severe that the US is not going to even be able to meet its own requirements. So why sign on to a thing that looks so impractical going into the future? And at that point, the proponents of AUKUS somehow were extremely gung-ho about the prospect that this will materialize, and that they had the support of not just the US, but also the UK. And this will all go forth in a direction that they ideally want to move in. And the talk was all about, if we don't move now, the Chinese are going to, take over the Western Pacific and that kind of thing. But it seems that the critics were right. And I just wonder, from the outside looking at this, that why weren't those skeptical voices given more attention? Why did that view not resonate in policymaking circles? I just wonder what happened. Perhaps Yan does have some insights.
I think John wanted to comment. Did you want to comment, John?
I did. I want to make one comment, and then I can try to take an answer to Abhijit's question. The first is the comment, and that is, I said there was little downside for the United States, but the one downside I kind of glossed over because I don't want to ramble on too long is shipyard capacity. And I was just right. The U.S. doesn't have enough capacity to even fulfill on time its relatively meager naval orders. And the thinking was at the launch that was okay, because one of the primary objectives of both Australia and the UK was work share for their own people, right? So the idea was there would be little work done in US yards, but there'd be some US revenue, and the revenue to some extent would be able to help invigorate the US submarine building system. That is probably the one place where the United States may have had some remorse, because as the deal played out and as we fleshed out the details, some of that, it does require some US yard capacity. And the US doesn't really want to give that up. So that's a downside. And if it gives it up and then the deal comes apart, that's even worse, because then that yard capacity was given to something that doesn't ultimately benefit the US or its allies. So that was sort of point one. I think point two, you say, why wasn't this brought into place? I think it was. The policy, this was kept very secret. It was kept very small for a whole nother reason, for reasons that make a lot of sense, but would be a whole nother conversation. But the people that were involved in that small group were not stupid, and they weren't naive, and they factored all of this in. They just, good policy takes some risk. And we actually had people in place that were ready to take some risks. And, risks may not play out. They may not play out for the best. But I think they factored it in.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly, the US is only going to lease Virginia class submarines to the Australian Navy in the initial first 10 years. The boats are actually going to be built for the Australian Navy by the Brits. It's going to be conjoined with their SSN program. The Americans are not building any boats for the Australians. Americans are going to build up their own Virginia class and either sell second-hand Virginias to Australia, initially lease them and perhaps sell them at a later date. So effectively, that force strength still remains with the US. So US really doesn't have to ramp up its capacity to cater for an Australian requirement. That is going to be done by the Brits. And more importantly, I think, AUKUS is getting overshadowed by the nuclear submarine part of it. The second, the technology part of AUKUS, Pillar 2, I think they call it, that has a lot more value to offer than perhaps even this. If you really look at the complete gamut of activity, not only for these three countries, but for their partners in the region. And that is where these multilaterals and trilaterals come into being with the 2+2 dialogues. A lot of these technologies can be shared with other partners. India, for example, can benefit from a lot of development in quantum being done as Pillar 2 of AUKUS, things like that. So I think overall, if you look at AUKUS in its entirety, it's a good thing. The submarine program, yes, is the sort of the main element of it. But like you said, perhaps they would have thought through most of it. That's why I said there will be setbacks perhaps in the program. But overall, I think it augurs well for the region. Personally, I think.
I think there's a couple of things there. Firstly, in the United States, where I'm sitting right now, in our debate, it's not clear whether we're going to go through with it or not. Because Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Trump wants to sell them. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, he doesn't. So 6 months down the line, that's going to be clear. There are senators who are saying we're not sure about this, precisely because of what you said, John, and what the Commodore said. The shipbuilding capacity now is just so poor that you can't even meet internal demands anymore. That's one part. But I think from the Australian perspective, what I think is good is, look, the whole idea of Five Eyes and all this is being challenged in Washington. They want to move on. They want to do other things. So the question from the Australian side is, how do you keep Australia relevant? AUKUS was a damn good idea to do that. And I would say this, that there were people who weren't in favor of AUKUS, Hugh White being, the most eminent of them. But then, unfortunately, nobody in Canberra listens to Hugh White. They're lost. But I'll get to the point which the Commodore makes, which I think is the really important one. What happens when conventional submarines in Australia get old, but replacing them? Now, you could do that with aircraft. When the F-111s didn't show up on time, you could buy Phantoms. When you could buy F-18s, you could buy more F-18s while you waited for the F-35. You can't do that with submarines. Submarines, as you point out, Commodore, have a long, long gestation period. And by the way, I'm so glad finally to meet somebody from the Indian Navy who is a proud submariner, because they all tend to be surface fleet and prefer not to talk about you guys. This is why Hyman Rickover used to be very upset. I'll leave it at that. Would anybody on the panel like to ask anybody else a question? Otherwise, no? Okay. All right. Sorry, go ahead.
I actually would want to. Am I audible? My screen is suddenly gone. Yeah, okay. So I'm having some trouble with my screen, but I'm just going to ask this one question that I had, which is that, India tends to talk a lot about outreach. We have the Sagar policy that Admiral Chauhan spoke about yesterday, and he said that this is not just a vision, it's a policy. We have concrete arrangements like the IPOI that support Sagar, and that our partners are completely on board. They try and support our initiatives in the region. But I want to know a perspective from the US and from Australia on how do they look at these initiatives. John cryptically mentioned in his comments that we need to do much more with IPMDA and IPOI. But is there a larger critique of what's happening in this space, or does the US think that India is trying to simply emphasize non-traditional security because it does not quite want to be involved in any kind of hard security matters in the Western Pacific? Or does it think that the Indian stand is completely understandable and that it's also it's also desired and recommended for non-Pacific states to content themselves with looking only at non-traditional security issues?
John, do you want to talk about, or Ian, about the Australian side? I'll talk about the American side. No? Okay. I'll give you the American side. The American side is every American president since George Bush Jr. And remember, I taught for 20 years at the US Air Force War College. So been there, done that, has wanted to make China front and center the issue. They're not concerned about non-traditional security. That's NGOs. And by the way, I do find it insulting that the French are being put into the Pacific Quad. That's like putting Dracula in charge of a blood bank, given their history with nuclear testing in that area. But my editorial comment aside, the real thing is they want to do China. The entire doctrine has been changed to air-sea battle. You're trying to build, or the next generation of nuclear weapons is low yield, so you can take out hardened Chinese targets. They're not talking non-traditional security. Non-traditional security, here's the thing. Non-traditional security will not get Trump's successor, let's say J.D. Vance for laughs, re-elected or elected, right? Taking a hard position on hard security issues is what matters in the United States. And the problem for the Americans is twofold. One, the sense in Washington is everybody in the Indo-Pacific is hedging. Because let's face facts, everybody on this panel, the Japanese, the Australians, the Indians, your largest trading partners are who? And yes, there may be an Australia-America free trade agreement. Every time I go to my Walmart, I don't find one Australian product, except Foster's, which may or may not be Australian. So here's the thing. The Americans are looking at the Indo-Pacific purely from a military security perspective. If you talk to the Southeast Asians, what they're interested in is America opening up markets to them, which has been very disappointing. If you talk to the small islands in the Pacific, which nobody can find on the map, unfortunately, their needs are more pressing. It's what you said, it's what Tess said. These are the things that matter to them. It's their livelihood. It's their lives. Okay. And I think that's just that's something which you'll never see coming in Washington. There's probably people with good intentions in the State Department, but find one person sitting on Trump's transition team who's talking about fisheries in the South Pacific. The answer is zero. And there's a third part to this, which you can't forget. The Chinese are the people who are spending the most money in the Indo-Pacific. It's not the United States. And how do you balance that? Which is why, if you look at this from Washington's perspective, in Washington, everybody who's sitting in Washington loves fighting the Russians because that's force on force. China is too complicated because it's geoeconomics, you name it, whatever. So my answer to you is, I think, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, I think if you're talking about a military security architecture, that's coming out pretty well from Washington. Now, can you get people to fit into that architecture is a different story. And you and I, Abhijit, are both quad skeptics. So that is there. If you're talking about the things that everybody in the panel talked about, which are far more important in the long run, if Maldives goes underwater, that's a humanitarian disaster which we haven't seen in our lifetimes. That has to come from the region. The funding has to come from the region. The initiatives have to come from the region. And believe me, I don't think anybody in Washington is going to sit there and say, the Indians are worried about Maldives going underwater. This is a bad thing. They could say, great. If you feel you can do something, if you can commit money to it, why not? Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that's the healthy way of balancing this off. The last time there was a big what was it? The typhoon went through Fiji. It was the Australian Air Force and the New Zealand Air Force which did the humanitarian relief. It wasn't the Americans. They came in much later. Just like when the Nepal earthquake happened, it's the Indians who went in first. The Americans came in 10 days later. So what I'm trying to say is stop thinking in terms of Quad and force on force with the Chinese, because you lose. And if you like, I can talk about that with you in Delhi sometime.
Can I just share with you, Dr. Gupta, a couple of years ago, when I was in the National Maritime Foundation, we were a delegation, we went to the CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis in Washington. And we were having a discussion, and we posed the question, why was US not very active in the Indian Ocean? This is pre-Quad. Yeah. And we got to hear something very interesting from Admiral Michael McDavid, who was then an active member there. And he said that Indian Ocean challenges are essentially non-military, other than the Persian Gulf, and they just don't produce the demand signal for us to be here. And I find that very interesting. That the US doesn't see why it should be so involved in the activities of the Indian Ocean, because generally, as you rightly said, they look at military challenges first, and they are prioritizing, I suppose, the China challenge at the moment. So that's how it's going to be.
We've run out of time. I'll just say one thing. The US's primary security concern is it should not lose unipolarity. That is okay. So whether it's Trump, whether it was Biden, whether it was Biden's Sancho Panza, Kamala Harris, none of them was saying we are headed towards a multipolar world. Okay. The minute you say that, you either have to talk geoeconomics or you've got to talk military strategy. Washington focuses on the latter. Hey, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry there were no questions from the audience, but I think it was a great panel, and I certainly learned something. So good night, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Okay, take care. Bye.
Thank you.